he was like, oh, gung-ho, and he was pushing for it. But ultimately also the one that holds the responsibility that gets blamed in that article for doing this, Donald Trump, because they've got in their explicit paragraph saying he was told in no uncertain terms that, Iran's likely to shut down the Gulf of Hormuz. And he was like, no, they're not going to do that.
It's area denial munitions, it's missiles. This changes the entire dynamic. Our Navy is not capable of forcing the Strait of Hormuz.
Larry, the Monday edition of The Economist magazine, which is a fairly credible and reliable international source, says clearly and without hesitation, the United States lost and Iran won. And Iran is in a stronger position now than it was before Trump's bombing. Don't you agree?
Oh, yeah. And that's a pretty impressive statement coming out as I recall. I think The Economist was or still is owned by the Rothschilds.
Right.
Yeah. So when they were ponying that up, look, I think we saw in the New York Times had an article out earlier this week explaining how the title was how Israel drove the United States to war. And I read that article, not so much for all the in and outs of who said what, but really to look at it and say, okay, who's going to be the scapegoat? Okay, so the villains in the article were Israel, Bibi Netanyahu and David Barnea, the Mossad chief, for lying to the United States. You had J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, and to a lesser extent, General Raisin Kane pushing back on it. Both and Ratcliffe, John Ratcliffe, the CIA director. So
Ratcliffe was apparently quite critical of Barnea, and he may have been critical afterwards when the Times got these quotes. Anyway, sorry for interrupting you.
It was, and apparently Marco Rubio used Ray McGovern's expression about male bovine excrement in reference to what the Israelis were predicting. Now, the one that was clearly identified as the American scapegoat, Pete Hegseth. Man, he was like, oh, gung-ho, and he was pushing for it. But ultimately also the one that holds the responsibility that gets blamed in that article for doing this, Donald Trump. Because they've got in their explicit paragraph saying he was told in no uncertain terms that, Iran's likely to shut down the Gulf of Hormuz. And he was like, no, they're not going to do that. So, when the media, like I said, when you've got a Rothschilds magazine putting that out, and then you got the New York Times, who's been also favorably disposed, and they're identifying the scapegoats because they recognize when the blame game starts, and Trump's not going to take the blame. You're going to.
Well, he's probably going to fire. Scotty, I would think he would have to fire Hegseth. He's got to blame somebody. Some head has to roll. It's not going to be his.
Judge, let me just make one other observation, though. What the war is going bad when they trot out Melania to do an Epstein presentation.
Who knew that Melania was accused of anything? Her denial received far more publicity than whatever she claimed to have been denying. Scotty, how could they not have thought that Hormuz would be closed? How could they not have planned for that?
Well, first of all, the military has planned for it. I mean, we have the Fifth Fleet right there, whose job is to keep the Strait of Hormuz open. I know for a fact that the Fifth Fleet in the 1990s believed that they could keep the Strait of Hormuz open. They believed that we had sufficient power to do that, but that was before Iran transitioned into, the military posture that it enjoys today. It's area denial munitions, it's missiles. This changes the entire dynamic. Our Navy is not capable of forcing the Strait of Hormuz. We would lose our fleet. And this is something that has been apparent for more than a decade now. And known, the Navy knows this. I mean, there's a lot of political blustering. You always see an admiral, we guarantee within X amount of time, if the Iranians try to shut it, we'll have it back open. But anybody who studies it would say, no, you don't. No, you can't. No, you won't. So this was a known. But again, the president, deals with, it's not that we couldn't I don't think the issue of forcing the Strait of Hormuz came up, because the scenario the Israelis played out was regime change will create the conditions in which we won't have to discuss the Strait of Hormuz.
Right.
Just like we won't have to discuss Iran's ability to sustain ballistic missile launches. If we change the regime, all of these other issues become moot. And so from Donald Trump's perspective, having embraced the Israeli posture, you didn't have to worry about the Strait of Hormuz because we were going to topple this regime. That's where he says that, he was taken by surprise. We didn't think the Iranians would be able to do it. Not that they, weren't planning on doing it. They couldn't do it. He just didn't believe that the regime would last long enough to be able to pull it off.
Yeah. Larry, doesn't Iran have enormous leverage in Islamabad now as they begin to negotiate, A, with the vice president, who's new to all this, and B, with these two clowns that tricked them in June and in February? I'm surprised the Iranians would even permit them to be there, Witkoff and Kushner. But before we talk about Witkoff and Kushner, doesn't Iran have the stronger hand?
Yeah, no, they do. They don't need the ceasefire. Donald Trump does, as Scott was pointing out earlier. This is all about November, and he can't afford. It's not so much the saying we won or lost the war per se. It is more what is happening to the global economy. What will happen to the global economy? We just got the report today. Inflation was up already 3% in the United States, and that's not even beginning to touch what's actually happening. But they have to say, yeah, that's bad. We've got more inflation. That inflation's going to grow. We're going to have recession tied in with inflation. It's called stagflation. Last time we saw that was about 50 years ago in the 70s. That's not a good record to go into an election with. So this is the problem they've got with these negotiations is that it's still indirect. I just read that the Iranians are going to be in one room, the Americans will be in another, and
who goes back and forth? The Pakistani people?
Yeah, Pakistani guy. So hopefully he's been at the gym this last week working out. Getting ready to for the exercise, running back and forth. But the reality is, the United States is desperate to sell a product, and Iran, they don't need the product. They're quite happy where they're at. And I'm not saying they're happy with being attacked, but they recognize they are now taken in a serious fashion like they'd never been before in the last 46 years. They are, and they're seizing the moment.
Wow. Scotty, your thoughts before we close.
Again, as long as we keep this, war is an extension of politics by other means. That's just straight up Sun Tzu, Clausewitz, and anybody else who ever studied war. And as long as we keep this political paradigm in place where it, as Larry said, it's all about November 7th, then Iran holds all the cards. But the Iranians have to be careful here because the president can't make all the compromises that Iran wants. Iran will have to give something back. And I know, they're winning and they've won and all that, but Iran, it's the same thing, the same dynamic we've seen with Russia, Ukraine, and NATO. Everybody's out there saying, Russia sets a red line, it gets crossed, Russia looks weak, Russia, the NATO's expanding. There's only one winner in this conflict right now, and it's Russia. And the reason why Russia is winning is that Russia kept the political dynamic the way it always was. Russia never changed the political dynamic. They managed escalation. And as a result, they weren't bogged down. They didn't change the political dynamic. And now they're dominating, the world on all fronts when it comes to energy and geopolitics, et cetera, because they kept it the same. The Iranians need to keep their eye on the ball. Right now, they're winning because of the political dynamic. And so the Iranians are in the driver's seat right now, but they can still screw this up if they overplay their hand.
Guys, thank you very much.